when I first went up there in a man lift and climbed through the little hole for the Starship initial rough prototype, I was like, this, like, what have we done? This thing is ridiculously big.
Good question, Elon. Why is Starship so big? And what are your thoughts on a whole bunch of other topics about SpaceX and space? Let's take a look. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. I am super excited to get the chance to delve into this conversation that Elon Musk had with Clay Mowry, the president of the IAF, at the 2023 International Astronautical Congress in Baku, Azerbaijan. The talk goes on for about 45 minutes, and I just don't have time to deal with all of it because a lot of it is kind of repetitive of things we've already heard before. So I'm going to leave a link in the description. I highly recommend listening to the whole thing. It starts about 14 minutes in. There's just 14 minutes of pre-roll. But anyway, it's a fantastic conversation, well worth it. And you'll also notice that I left up the little time thing at the bottom, so you'll see my mouse annoyingly across the bottom. But that was so that both I and you can see, you know, the minutes and seconds and stuff. So if you want to go back and look at that specific moment and get more of the context around any of those moments, you can easily go to that point in the conversation. So first of all, a really big thanks to Clay for actually asking some new questions, not the same old stuff over and over again. So that was wonderful. I actually was talking to people after this, conversing on Twitter and on my Patreon Discord and everything. And people are like, oh my gosh, it was so nice to hear Elon get asked questions that he's not asked 100 times already. So those are the things I'm going to focus on more. You'll see that I actually started about 33 minutes into the conversation when Elon talks about how big the Starship is, not just because it's kind of funny and he's just like, holy mackerel, this thing's big, as you heard in the cold open, but also he gets into the reason why they had to build it so big. Now, this is stuff that we've heard before, but it leads into other things. So I thought it was worth going over and starting the video at this point.
It looks absurd, frankly. It's like, wow, this is ridiculously gigantic. That was my first impression when I first went up there in a man lift and climbed through the little hole for the Starship initial rough prototype. I was like, this, like, what have we done? This thing is ridiculously big. So now this actually can be great for science, though. One of the exciting projects that we're working with is with the Sol Perlmutter at Berkeley on a telescope, a space telescope, that is able to use it's got an enormous lens. I think it's perhaps a 7 or 8 meter diameter lens, and it's actually a satellite that was meant for the lens was meant for a ground-based satellite. But if you then take that same satellite and put it in orbit, its capabilities are greatly enhanced because you don't have the obfuscation of the atmosphere. So that's why, for example, the Hubble, which is actually a fairly small telescope, can do better than I think any historical ground satellite, especially in the visual spectrum. So we're very excited about what it can do for space science. Because really at this point, especially for any photons where there's interference with the atmosphere, so any sort of short wavelength photons, you really want your satellite to be in vacuum, or rather your telescope to be in vacuum. Yeah. So that's really the future. So I think there's a lot of exciting potential there for planetary for space science.
Okay, so as you heard, actually Elon Musk starts by talking about science potential, and I'm sure everyone already knows about the Hubble Space Telescope and also the James Webb Space Telescope. The Hubble Space Telescope has a diameter, the lens itself, the mirror on the telescope is about 2.1 meters, I believe, if that's correct, somewhere right around there. Anyway, so about, a little bit taller than me. If you, took me and laid me across, it'd be that big, but it's not that big for a modern telescope. The James Webb has about an 8-meter surface, but they had to fold the thing up origami style to fit it into a fairing that would work with a standard rocket launching vehicle, So the Starship will be able to launch much larger diameter telescopes without all the folding up stuff. And that was the one of the biggest reasons why it was such an expensive endeavor. So they'll be able to launch, as Elon said, basically ground-based telescopes up into space without having to do as much work as they had to do with the James Webb. More on that in a minute, but first, if you're like me and you love to learn, then CuriosityStream is for you. With a focus on science, history, and technology, CuriosityStream makes it easy and entertaining to expand your knowledge of all kinds of topics. CuriosityStream has thousands of documentaries and nonfiction titles, including award-winning original content you can't find anywhere else. CuriosityStream is available on many platforms like computers, phones, game systems, and even smart TVs, so you can learn and be entertained just about anywhere. It's also constantly updated with awesome, timely content, so you can stay up to date on the latest topics. Right now, I'm watching Hack the Moon, a great documentary about technology and the history of the Apollo space missions, two of my favorite topics together in one. I also love iHuman, about the rise of intelligent machines and robots, and Breakthrough, a science series about various topics like the search for life on Jupiter's moons and the quest for fusion power. With amazing plans starting at under $5 a month, you can get great original content on a budget that fits your needs. Go to curiositystream.com/Dr. No or scan the QR code on the screen for unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and nonfiction series. And just for you, use the promo code Dr. No and you will save 25% off. Thanks to CuriosityStream for sponsoring today's video. Be sure to click the link in the description to stay curious, and now let's get back to it. He next turns to talking about why it's really, really important to getting to the moon and to Mars and building a permanent colony there.
But like I said, the really fundamentally, the reason it's so gigantic is that if you're on a long journey to Mars, I think being cooped up in something the size of a minivan would be unappealing to most people.
So that's amusing, but also it's pretty accurate, right? If you've ever been inside, like some space museums and stuff have like an Apollo capsule you can get inside, or a Mercury or a Gemini capsule or something, it's not a kind of place that you want to spend months. You don't want to be cooped up that much. Elon gets back to the discussion about this and more specifics shortly, but first he takes a little sidetrack about factories and about how you can visit Boca Chica anytime you want to, drive down the road and, look at these starships like up close and personal like we have.
Yeah, so we are building a giant factory for a giant rocket. I mean, honestly, I recommend people visit Starbase. As it turns out, it's on a state highway. So I think it's one of the rare situations where, and I actually don't mind, I think it's kind of cool that the public can actually drive within a literal stone's throw away from the factory and the launch site and actually see the rocket firsthand. And in fact, if you go on the internet right now, including on the X platform, there are people who are live streaming at 24/7, the entire construction, launch pad, everything. So it's people say like, well, can I go see it? It's so easy to go see. You can just literally fly to Brownsville and drive to the beach, and you can see it literally a stone's throw away, the factory and the launch site. So anyone who wants to do that, I recommend it. It's very, very easy. No permission required.
So, of course, if you compare this to pretty much anywhere else, including Cape Canaveral in Florida, you can't get close to any of the rockets. Everything is behind closed doors. You can see the vehicle assembly building when you take a tour as you drive past in a bus and all of that kind of stuff. But really, SpaceX is a pretty unique place. Boca Chica, I don't think it was quite intentional on SpaceX's part. They just built it there and there was a highway, but it's a state highway and there's a state beach, both of which are public access. So it's just open. And I do appreciate that Elon says he doesn't mind that. There would be a lot of people who would probably say like, nope, don't really want people to be driving down this. I'm very upset about that, and would try to change things. But he seems philosophical about it. He's like, you know what? Everybody can go see it, and you should go see it. And again, if you have any interest in rocketry and space and astronomy and where the future of humanity might be going, I highly recommend going down there at least once and taking a look, because it is a fascinating journey. It is a little off the beaten track. I mean, I would recommend flying into probably Houston or something instead of Brownsville, because it's going to cost a lot less money to fly into Houston. But then it's about a 6 or 7 hour drive to get down to Boca Chica from there. So it's it's not, unless you happen to live in southeastern Texas, it's not an easy place to get to. But once you're down there, it's no problem at all. Nobody will stop you. You can just drive down, unless, of course, they're launching a rocket, in which case they're going to block you off from going there. But under normal circumstances, you can just drive down the road and you can go take a look. Next up, Elon talks about where they build the engines in Los Angeles as well. And by the way, you can go visit there as well. I did that very recently when I went down, and you can see a video from there here if you're interested.
The engines are still manufactured in California at SpaceX headquarters in Los Angeles, which is also it's also an odd location. That's where we built the Falcon 9 rockets and the Dragon spacecraft. Really, about 5 minutes from LAX, at sort of what used to be a Northrop headquarters, I believe.
So yeah, it is about 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes from LAX with traffic and everything. My brother also lives about 5 or 10 minutes from LAX as well, but they form sort of a triangle because he lives in Manhattan Beach. But anyway, it takes very little time for me to get from my brother's house or LAX to Hawthorne to check out the SpaceX factory. Next up, Elon starts to discuss how to build a colony on the moon and a permanent settlement on Mars, and how many tons of material are going to need to get into space in order to make that happen.
If you look at in the grand scheme of things, say, okay, what is required to have a self-sustaining base on Mars or city on Mars? You have to really think of it in terms of very large tonnage. And if we could even get the tonnage estimate to correct within an order of magnitude, I think we'd be doing well. I think we should probably aim for something like 1 million tons of useful load delivered to the surface of Mars, which requires roughly 5 million tons to Earth orbit. So, because you get about 20, for whatever mass you get to Earth orbit, you get about 20% of that mass landed to the surface of Mars. Give or take, maybe you can get 25% optimistically. So that's why this thing is so gigantic, is we've got to get 5 million tons to Earth to orbit, which hopefully gets about 1 million tons to the surface of Mars. And hopefully 1 million tons is enough to create a self-sustaining city on Mars.
So first of all, Elon fully admits he doesn't know even the order of magnitude of how much stuff is going to have to get transported to Mars to create a self-sustaining civilization. So none of us do. I mean, he's not saying that because he's stupid or anything. He's saying that because it's a very, very difficult problem to solve. But the estimate that he and other people have done is that it will take 1 million tons of things, like walls and electronics and bulldozers and whatnot, in order to build a self-sustaining city on Mars. That is a lot. And even more daunting is it will take about 5 times that much to get into orbit in order to get 1 million tons to Mars. So in order to get 1 million tons to Mars, you need to get about 5 million tons to low Earth orbit so that you can then take it from low Earth orbit and get it to Mars. So there's a lot of fuel mostly. I imagine fuel is the biggest part of that 80% that's being, wasted. And then of course, rocketry components and other things like that. So there's pieces that are going to have to be built and expended and a lot of fuel in order to get from low Earth orbit to Mars. So it's a 5-to-1 ratio they're approximating. So we're looking at a huge challenge to get that amount of stuff to Mars to be able to create, again, a self-sustaining city. That's not just to get a person there to look and put a flag down and then come back home again or something. We're talking about building a city there, an actual self-sustaining city. Elon is very all about having kind of an Earth 2.0 someplace else in case something bad happens here. I hope it doesn't, but so that in case something does happen bad here, that there is some way of restarting or maintaining civilization somewhere else. So to put this in context, Elon later confirms that SpaceX is going to put approximately 1,600 tons into orbit this year. That's 1,600 tons. We need 5 million tons to orbit, right? So that means that we need to get approximately 3,100 times, not percent, but times more stuff into orbit than SpaceX is going to do this year. That's why the Starship has to be so ridiculously large. And of course, it can't just be really gigantic. It also has to be reusable. Elon says the 4 R's: rapidly, reusable, reliable, rocket. So anyway, those things have to happen. It can't just be big, because if it's just really gigantic and it costs $4 billion a launch and you throw it away, SLS, you're going to be looking at something that you can't get that much stuff into orbit. You just can't do it economically. So Starship not only needs to be gigantic, but it needs to be rapidly and reliably reusable. And that is a ridiculous undertaking. Next, Clay asks Elon when he thinks that the first mission is going to land on Mars.
any predictions on when Starship might land on Mars without crew, maybe a crewed flight? Any prediction there?
I think 3 or 4 years.
4 years. That would
Yeah,
be
something like.
all right.
I have to check with the Earth Mars. Earth and Mars. Have orbital synchronization about every 26 months. So you can't just fly to Mars when it's on the other side of the sun from Earth. That's unwieldy. So roughly every 26 months, the orbits are in the right relative position, and then you have the Mars transport window. So I think but I think it's sort of feasible within the next 4 years to do an uncrewed test landing there. Yeah.
So first of all, I'm surprised he didn't say 2 weeks. Ha 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 ha. But second of all, 4 years seems like a reasonable thing for an unmanned rocket. So that gives them, let's say, another 3 years to work on Starship and Super Heavy and get it working really, really well before they're going to need to start ramping up to actually get the thing to fly to Mars. And you never know, they might actually do a couple of those, right? If they have a few of the rockets available, they might launch 2 or 3 of them to Mars to just test it all out, because it's going to be a very experimental flight. They're going to have to do propulsive landing. There's a good chance the thing's going to crash on Mars, or at least 1 or 2 of them will. So they might send a few of the rockets there rather than just one, in order to maximize the potential at that point, that window. Because like he says, the Earth and Mars orbit the sun at different rates. And so Mars is going slower than the Earth. And so they match up so that you can get there efficiently every 26 months or so. So you can't just do it whenever you want. So there's windows of time every 2+ years. Next, Clay asks about the lunar Starship, which is the one that NASA is funding to go to the moon, and whether that's going to be distracting from Tesla's main mission or not.
Really, Starship should be a generalized transport system to anywhere in the solar system. That's the intent. With when you have propulsive landing, you can land anywhere, whether there's an atmosphere, no atmosphere. It's not really dependent on water. Obviously, for crewed capsules on Earth, we've generally gone with parachutes and water. And in Russia it's on land, but then they need retro rockets right at the end to sort of slow things down. So a propulsive system should generalize to be able to land anywhere on a solid surface, anywhere on in the solar system. So the moon, while it's sort of dusty, the moon is actually harder than it's not just a big dust pile. So it's harder than you'd think. The lunar regolith. So I'm sort of optimistic that we can take a Starship that's fairly unmodified from what would land on Earth or Mars. Obviously, you need legs, but apart from that, I suspect you could land the Starship with minor modifications on the moon. And the same would go for once you have a propellant plant on Mars, you could then go to the asteroid belt and the moons of Jupiter. If you can establish a propellant plant there, then you could go to the moons of Saturn and ultimately all the way out into the Kuiper belt and Oort cloud.
So did you hear how Elon went from the moon all the way to the Oort cloud? That's pretty cool. But basically the physics of this is the hardest thing to do is take off from the Earth. The Earth is very, very massive. Once you get something on the moon, on the lunar surface, that's got 1/6 the gravity, Mars has 1/3 the gravity, those are much easier to depart from and go someplace else. So if you can build out the infrastructure like fueling stations and things like that on the moon and on Mars, you can then sort of leapfrog to the next step, which is to go to the moons of Jupiter. You could build a fueling station there. There's like Europa and stuff that has a lot of water. So it's relatively easy to extract propellant. And then you can go from there to Saturn, do the same thing, and then go from there all the way out into the outer solar system. So that's a really, really big far off ask sort of thing. I would love to be around to see that happen, but I don't expect that's going to happen in my lifetime unless there's major life extension kind of stuff that happens. But I do hope that I will see Mars. I do hope that I will see people on Mars. having communication and maybe see the beginnings of that city taking place. Because even with the 5 million tons to low Earth orbit and 1 million tons to Mars, that is something that Starship, should be able to do in a couple of decades. It's not something that's impossible with a ship this big. Next, Clay asks about a really, really crucial step, which is propellant transfer in low Earth orbit. In other words, taking propellant out of one Starship tanker and putting it into another one so that that Starship can then go onto the moon or Mars or wherever it needs to go.
Really, propellant transfer is a similar problem to just docking. Now, we've gotten pretty good at docking with the Dragon going to the space station. And docking with the space station is really quite difficult because we didn't design the space station, and the space station has a lot of complexities and has crew on board. So we have to be extremely careful, and so docking with the space station is like, I would say, it's far more difficult to dock with the space station than it would be to dock with our own spaceship. And so propellant transfer just really means that we send a Starship up there with no payload, and it just transfers its propellant to a ship that is already there. So you have to dock with the ship that is going to Mars or the moon, and transfer the propellant from a version of the ship that has no cargo. Now there'll be a future sort of tanker optimized version of Starship where we we stretch the tanks and have little to no cargo space because that's the optimal thing for a tanker. But you don't have to do that. That'll increase the propellant load of the tanker, or the propellant transferability of the tanker. But it's not absolutely necessary. You could in theory use an unmodified Starship and transfer propellant that way.
So an interesting thing about this is Elon doesn't seem particularly worried about all of this because he said they already know how to do the docking with the International Space Station, and how, because it was not designed as part of SpaceX's vehicles, it's actually more complicated. And of course, there's humans in there, so that makes it much more risky too. You have to be super, super careful docking with the International Space Station. So he's saying that the docking procedure between the tanker Starship and the Starship that's going to go someplace would be relatively easier. Now, in my mind, he sort of skips over the most important part of that answer, which is, yeah, okay, you can do the docking, but how do you do the propellant transfer? That's not the easiest thing in the world because it's sloshing around. It's in free fall. You're going to have to transfer this. You're going to have to use some sort of ullage thrusters or something like that to transfer these things, or turbo pumps, or I don't know. So the docking part is not what I'm personally worried about. I think that's a relatively solved problem that's been solved since the Gemini program in the 60s. The important part of this is, how do you actually do the propellant transfer in a weightless environment that's super hot and super cold? But, Elon doesn't really answer that, so we'll have to wait and see on that front. Next up, Clay asks Elon about how many launches and where the launches are going to have to come from in order to get this kind of mass to orbit.
I would imagine that you're doing this and you may have multiple launches in either rapid succession or maybe multiple pads launching multiple versions of the vehicle. Does that all take place from Texas, and how quickly do those launches have to take place to make this work?
Yeah, we'll have a launch site in Texas as well as in Florida. So we've actually partially built a Starship launch pad at Pad 39A, which is where we launch Falcon Heavy and our crewed Dragon. So we've partially built, and we'll fully build that out over time, and probably have at some point a greenfield location for Starship at the Cape. Now, in the sort of, you say like 4 or 5 year time frame, where perhaps we're launching several times a day, then we may need to go to an ocean-based platform. Just if you're launching, I don't know, 10 times a day, that might be a bit much even for the Cape. I don't know. So we may end up doing platform-based launches from a specially designed sort of ocean-going platform. but we will need to do a lot of launches. I mean, we're talking about thousands of launches per year.
So Elon somewhat carefully seemed to answer the question about Texas. He said, "Oh yeah, obviously we're going to have more than Texas. If you don't know, there's all these issues with the National Fish and Wildlife Service and the FAA and all of that kind of stuff that are causing some friction in terms of SpaceX being able to launch. They have the Super Heavy and the Starship ready to go basically any day, and they're just waiting on licensing right now. That should not be such an issue in Cape Canaveral because they're already used to that. But if they start looking at having to launch 10 times per day, he's saying, which is kind of insane, then they're going to have to look at doing something offshore. Now, they did purchase those 2 oil rigs previously, but the last I heard, they decided that they didn't need them anymore and they sold them on down the river or the ocean or whatever. So they would probably have to repurchase some oil rigs, some used oil rigs or something like that if they want to do that, or purpose build something themselves at some point. But he's talking about several years into the future, so not an urgent concern right now. And then Elon talks about how much mass to orbit needs to happen per year in order to make this all take place in a reasonable time frame.
And so you do get up to the sort of what I was talking about, million tons or 5 million tons to orbit, that if you've got, 1,000 launches a year, each of which do over 100 tons, that's 100,000 tons of a cargo, per year to orbit. That's still not quite enough. I think we'd want to get to roughly 1 million tons of orbit per year, to Earth orbit per year, which would mean that you get to 1 million tons to Mars in 5 years.
So yeah, those numbers are kind of crazy. 1,000 launches at 100 tons for 100,000 tons to orbit. And then he says, but we actually need 10 times that much to happen per year in order to get the city built in 5 years. Now, if you want to do it in 50, you can do 100,000 per year and it'll just take forever. But there is a certain amount of speed with which this is going to have to happen. And of course, again, because of the transfer window, you can't do it continuously. So it's going to be this sort of crazy thing where you just build up a gigantic fleet, probably in low Earth orbit, and then they all, when the window opens, go taking off to Mars. So it's going to be a pretty nutty sight if this ever happens the way that he's imagining it, which of course gets back to Elon's urgency about this project.
Well, making life multiplanetary, you've got to be in the sort of hundreds of thousands to millions of tons to Earth orbit per year.
Unbelievable numbers, really. As somebody who worked in the launch business for several years, it's incredible for me to even try to think about that much mass to orbit in 1 year.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy. Ludicrous mode, I think. Yeah, for launch.
Very much so.
Yeah.
But it's either we do that or we're a single planet species forever.
So there you have it. Ludicrous mode or not, you either get 1 million tons to Mars from Earth, or humanity remains a single planet species forever. It's pretty much that simple, and that really does explain his urgency with this. At this point, Clay turns from the broader vision of the future to a mission that's coming up very soon, the Polaris mission that Jared Isaacman is funding and doing, where there's going to be an actual spacewalk by a civilian.
You're also working on a Polaris mission that's going to allow, I think, Dragon to open and have people actually floating in space, doing an EVA, and you're building a spacesuit for that. So you can talk to a little bit about that spacesuit, and can you use that same suit on the Moon and Mars and for other missions?
Yeah, so the SpaceX spacesuit, we do expect to evolve that to be something that can be an EVA suit on the ground on the Moon and Mars. It started off initially as really just a pressure suit, just in case there's an emergency depressurization of the spacecraft. So it was basically like a self-contained life support system in suit form. Obviously we'll retain that capability, but now for an upcoming flight, we want to do an EVA or extra vehicle, basically go float around in space, still on a tether, so it's not going to be an independent little spacesuit that's just flying around. We could do that, and maybe that'll happen on a future flight. But it will be a tethered EVA. You're just out there floating in the void,
So yeah, we're talking about something like the Gemini missions where the person is going to exit the spacecraft, but still connected with a tether, which will not only, connect them there, but I think it sounds like the life support is going to be on the spacecraft, not on the person's back. So if you think about the Apollo landing, like right there, if I can get it, I can never do this backwards. There we go. So anyway, you can see that landing, the person's got a backpack with a full life support on it. In this case, we're going to be talking about the life support backpack being inside the spacecraft. And so the person who's out in space doing the spacewalk is just going to have a relatively minimal suit on with the life support supplied by the ship. But still, this suit is a much more advanced suit than what they have in the Dragon capsule right now, because that's just an emergency suit. That's like if something happened and the cabin depressurized, you would not perish, right? You have something on to keep you alive for some sort of emergency thing. But for a situation like this where you're doing an actual EVA, they're obviously building a much more robust spacesuit. So it's going to be really cool to watch that when it happens. Next, Clay asks the question on everyone's mind: will there be a Cybertruck on the moon?
Are you thinking about making a Tesla rover, maybe Moon or Mars? Any ideas for Cybertruck on the moon?
It would look cool, that's for sure. Now, the nice thing about electric cars is that obviously do not require oxygen to. They're not combustion cars, so they don't have to ingest oxygen from the ambient atmosphere. Yeah, I think Tesla could easily make a car that like a Cybertruck lunar variant. Just get the moon option package.
So first of all, how badass would a Cybertruck look on the moon? I mean, it's already got the right colors and everything. And of course, I think Tesla should actually sell the moon option package for the Cybertruck. I think they would actually make a fortune. Just like the Boring Company sells burnt hair and stuff, they should sell a moon options package. Just a little hint to Tesla, if you want to make some more money on the Cybertruck, maybe it could be a wrap, maybe it could be some cool little gewgaws and stuff that you get inside the Cybertruck, but they should definitely do the moon option package. Next, Clay asks how long the Starship can stay in orbit and whether it could be used as a self-sustaining space station on its own.
So how long could Starship be in orbit?
Yeah, could it be its own space station? If you wanted to put a Starship up with the capability, a laboratory, how long could that could it stay in orbit and still come down?
Oh, there's no real limit. It could stay in orbit for a very long time. The volume of the Starship fairing is roughly comparable to the volume of the International Space Station. So there's about 1,000 cubic meters of volume in the fairing, and I think space station's a comparable amount. Yeah.
And would have the power to run a lot of laboratory experiments. Sorry.
Yeah. So given that it's a similar volume to the space station. You could do what you're doing in the space station on a Starship if you want, but there's no limit to how long it can stay up there. It's really just you need solar panels, battery, and some thrusters to maintain orbit.
So this is a really cool thought. Starship on its own is about the same volume as the ISS, the habitable volume. And of course, the ISS took, I don't even know how many launches, but Space Shuttle, many, many launches of the Space Shuttle, many Russian launches. It took a ton of launches to get the International Space Station into orbit and constructed. And if you could just do that as one gigantic Starship, even if you didn't bring it back down again, you could just put one up there as, Starship Space Station or something, put some solar panels on it, put some living quarters in it, things like that, launch it up and then dock with it even with a Dragon or something and put crew on there. That would be a really fast way to get a full-size space station that would actually even be more spacious because, of course, the ISS, it's relatively small because it had to fit within the diameter of the fairings of the rockets that could carry it. The Starship, of course, has a much larger diameter, so it would probably be even more comfortable and more spacious than the ISS is. Next, Clay gets back down to Earth and asks about using Starship as point-to-point transport between cities on Earth.
You kind of hinted at a little bit of the point-to-point capability of transportation. I can't remember the exact amount of time to get from one side of the world to the next, but can you talk about that? How do you see the future of point-to-point using Starship?
Yeah, so the fastest way with known physics to get from one place to another on Earth is with a intercontinental ballistic missile. This is why ICBMs with nukes are kind of like the ultimate weapon. Now, in this case, it's sort of delete the nuke, add landing. But it's certainly very feasible. Obviously, if we can take off and land on Mars or the Moon, we can take off and land on Earth too. So it really comes down to a question of is it economically viable compared to long-distance aircraft? And I think our back-of-the-envelope numbers suggest that it actually has a shot at being economically viable for long-distance transport on Earth for a few reasons. The propellant cost is actually quite low, being liquid methane, liquid oxygen. The cost of liquid oxygen, it's primarily liquid oxygen. It's about 78% liquid oxygen by mass and roughly 22 or 23% liquid methane. So the propellant cost is it's the lowest cost propellant you could possibly get on Earth. And then because the rocket's moving so fast, you can use it in theory, about 10 times more than you could use an aircraft. So, so Falcon 9, Starship can go from, let's say, Los Angeles to Sydney or something like that in 20 minutes, basically, maybe half an hour at most. So, whereas I think an airliner takes about 14 or 15 hours. So you've got something which is really much faster than an aircraft. And so for an airliner that you can do basically an order of magnitude more trips with Starship than you can with an airliner, which means that no pilots are needed. In fact, you can't pilot. This is not only a computer can pilot this because human reaction times are not fast enough. So then you don't have the pilot costs, you don't have the food costs, you don't have the you don't really even need bathrooms if you can get there in half an hour.
Okay, so first of all, I travel with my wife enough to know that no bathrooms on the Starship would probably make her not actually want to travel on it. But anyway, in a more serious vein, this is really interesting stuff, right? So the fuel cost, if you take away the cost of the vehicle itself, of the rocket, and you just get down to fuel cost, yeah, it will cost more per trip. But if you can do approximately an order of magnitude or 10 times more trips, because it only takes like a half hour to go each direction, as opposed to the better part of a day to fly an airplane, then by utilizing the craft many more times, 10 times more than an airplane, you're able to amortize that cost across more flights, which allows it to become less expensive, which makes it competitive with airlines. And of course, on a time thing, there's no comparison whatsoever. I would way rather go from LA to Sydney in a half an hour than 15 hours. And then interestingly enough, he brings up no pilot, things like that. You really don't need anything like that. Maybe one or two crew, but really you're in a boost phase, then you're weightless, then you're in a braking phase and a landing phase. So there's really no opportunity to get out of the seat. You're strapped in the whole time. So there's really not even that much need for crew there. So it really would become cheaper from a human cost as well as from the utilization of the vehicle cost. So when will this happen? I don't know. It's probably going to be quite a while because it's going to have to be super, super safe before it'll be allowed to happen. But 10 or 15 years, maybe 20, something like that, I could see it actually taking place. And it will have less issues than something like the Concorde because you won't really have sonic boom issues except right at the spot where you're taking off and right at the spot where you're landing. You won't have those issues going across. So the reason why the Concorde couldn't fly from New York to Los Angeles, for example, was the entire way it was flying, it was doing sonic booms. It was like crack, 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 crack across the whole country. People don't want to listen to that every day going back and forth and everything. That's a huge noise pollution issue. So with this, you're going out into space and then you're coming back in again. And so as you do that, you don't really have to deal with atmospheric sonic booms or anything like that during most of the actual flight. Plus, if you get above the Kármán line, which is like 62 miles or 100 kilometers, then everybody becomes an astronaut too, and that would be worth it in its own right. Next, Clay brings up Starlink, and it really leads to some very interesting thoughts on Elon's part.
So you're connecting now, I think, something like 2 million people with Starlink, right? With your satellite communication system and growing rapidly. You're mastering communications from space to Earth, from low Earth orbit. You're now doing inter-satellite links with this system. What do you see for Starlink being used as a relay, let's say around the moon, or for comm relay all the way to Mars and back?
Well, for Mars, Mars, you'd want basically like a laser relay system. Essentially, it sort of depends on what bandwidth you're looking for. Obviously, in order to have continuous coverage with Mars, you'd have to have some relay system, because you can't transmit through the sun. So when Mars is on, when the sun is between you and Mars, you have to do a bank shot through a relay satellite, so that your photons don't have to go through the sun. So and then you have to say, well, ultimately we would want, terabit, maybe petabit level data transfer between Earth and Mars. So then you're gonna want probably some relay satellites along the way to be able to do that. It's a bandwidth thing. You'd want to use lasers, and then the laser beam is going to widen with distance, so that then you need to be able to receive the laser beam before it gets too wide. This means that you need a series of satellites in order to communicate with Mars at its furthest distance, especially with very high bandwidth. Well, you can obviously do low bandwidth with longer wavelength photons, but if there's a human city on Mars, you'd want to have very high bandwidth. So therefore, a bunch of lasers. And satellite, Starlink already uses lasers for inter-satellite communication.
So first of all, how cool is lasers? I love that we'll have to have laser communication, but terabit or petabit level communication is kind of an impressive, thing that he's thinking about. And clearly Elon has thought about this. He's like, okay, how do we communicate with Mars in an efficient manner? And the fact that Earth and Mars could be on the opposite side of the sun at some points in their orbits. So you'll need other satellites around and relay satellites, because of course, even though lasers are very highly collimated, they will eventually diverge. So they will need relay satellites floating in space between Earth and Mars to pick up those signals and, retransmit them, just like we have on internet on Earth. And of course, it's super exciting that 2 million people, including me right now, are using Starlink on the Earth. That's a really impressive figure, and of course it will grow rapidly over the coming years. Finally, Clay asks Elon the question of why. Why do all this stuff? And Elon immediately turns to his favorite book of all time, I believe.
Do you have a message for these young people, the young engineers and scientists that are here? Many of them have been inspired by you. Anything you can say to them about pursuing a career in space, or what motivated you to do all the things that you're doing?
I mean, I'm interested in that which furthers civilization, and I think we want to expand the scope and scale of consciousness so as to better understand the nature of the universe, and even to understand which questions to ask. Like, one of the most inspiring books I ever read was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where they're trying to understand the meaning of life in the Hitchhiker's Guide. And the larger message of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is that you actually need to know what questions to ask about the answer that is the universe. And we don't yet know what questions to ask. So I'm just curious, really. I'm just curious as to the nature of reality. Where does it all go to? Where does it come from? Where are the aliens, for example? Are there aliens? Are we alone? People often ask me if I'm seen any evidence of aliens, and I unfortunately have seen no evidence of aliens yet. We are the aliens, as far as I can tell. And I think if anyone would know, it would probably be me, and I have not seen any evidence of aliens. So what that perhaps suggests is that this tiny candle of consciousness that is humanity is all that exists in a vast darkness. And we should do everything we can to ensure that the candle does not go out.
So, of course, Elon had to mention The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Fantastic book, fantastic series of books. If you haven't read it, you definitely should. And he goes back to, his standard way of speaking about this. He doesn't see any aliens out there. I don't see any aliens out there. I don't think most of us see any aliens out there. For all we know, we are the only conscious beings in the entire universe. That's a sad and a scary thought, but it also implies a huge responsibility. It means that we are responsible for holding this candle of consciousness and transmitting it to the galaxy and eventually the universe. And I think that that is a pretty darn good reason to do what he does. So I, for one, am wholeheartedly behind Elon's mission, and I hope that he succeeds in getting us to Mars and eventually to the outer planets and the Oort cloud and on from there. All right, I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it fun and interesting and thought-provoking. If you did, please do like it so other people can find it. And of course, consider subscribing for more of this kind of content. As always, a huge shout out to my Patreon patrons, my YouTube channel members, and of course, my ex-subscribers. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel in any way that you can. And of course, if you want to join any of the teams, just check out the links in the description. And if you're interested in a whole bunch of really cool merch, check out our merch store. Link is in the description. We have TeslaBot t-shirts, the Tesla meme t-shirt, Success is a Possible Outcome, 4680 battery cells. All of that stuff is on t-shirts, mugs, tumblers, and on and on. So check it out. And finally, a big thanks once again to CuriosityStream for sponsoring today's video. Be sure to check out my link in the description. Get access to all of CuriosityStream's amazing educational videos. Start learning today, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.